Today, former FTX employees and insiders take the stand in Sam Bankman-Fried's trial. And Paul Tuchmann, a former federal prosecutor, explains how SBF's public comments after the collapse of FTX could be used against him. Welcome to CNBC's Crypto World. I'm Tanea McKeel. Crypto markets mixed this morning, with Bitcoin ticking about 0.5% higher, Ether meanwhile losing a little less than 1%, and Cardano jumping 1.5%. All right, we're on to day 3 of Sam Bankman-Fried's trial, and we're getting right down to witness testimony. Longtime friend to SBF and FTX software engineer Adam Yedidia began his testimony yesterday and took the stand again today. Yedidia appeared under an immunity order because he said he was concerned he may have unwittingly written code that contributed to a crime. As part of his testimony, Yedidia remembered telling SBF about a bug in the code that revealed $8 billion in liabilities Alameda owed to FTX. He said when he asked if things were okay, Sam Bankman-Fried allegedly said, "We were bulletproof last year, we're not bulletproof this year." SBF maintains that he was unaware of the mismanagement at the company and didn't intend to defraud anyone. Today, FTX co-founder Gary Wang is also expected to take the stand. He pleaded guilty to defrauding investors back in December. To talk more about the trial, Crypto World's Talia Kaplan sat down with former federal prosecutor Paul Tuchmann yesterday to have him lay out the charges and procedures involved.
You have extensive experience prosecuting and defending fraud cases here in New York. You served as an assistant U.S. attorney for the Eastern District of New York for 11 years. And currently, your practice represents and advises clients as it pertains to criminal defense, regulatory compliance, and more. So given all your experience, I'm curious to get your take on the trial of Sam Bankman-Fried and all the media attention associated with it. In fact, during jury selection, the potential jurors said they have heard of Sam Bankman-Fried. The majority of them said they have heard of him, citing periodicals as the main source. One potential juror said he learned about Sam Bankman-Fried from a Joe Rogan podcast. So given all the media attention, the high-profile nature of this case, how can that play into the trial itself?
Well, certainly it's going to be a risk for the defense. The pretrial publicity in this case, certainly none of it was very favorable to the defendant. And lots of people through news coverage have likely heard about the volume of losses that were apparently suffered by FTX depositors, by related lenders and investors. And so it's certainly something that the defense tries very hard to overcome in the jury selection process, to try and do their best to get jurors who, at a minimum, have not made up their minds or haven't formed an opinion about the defendant, and even better, if possible, who are among those who haven't actually heard of the case.
So shortly before the arrest of Sam Bankman-Fried in December, actually, he spoke publicly about the collapse of FTX at the New York Times Deal Book Summit, where he said that he takes the blame and he's responsible for the, quote, huge management failures at the company. How is that going to impact his case, the fact that he spoke publicly?
Well, it certainly is likely that the prosecution is going to use those statements against him, that they're going to, assuming that there's a recording of it, they're going to play it for the jury at some point. And while that statement in itself is not necessarily the be-all and end-all of the case, it certainly creates additional hurdles for his defense team to overcome if they're going to get a not guilty verdict or even a hung jury.
So Sam Bankman-Fried pleaded not guilty to the 7 federal charges against him. Those charges include fraud and conspiracy. Can you talk about the charges? Why those specific charges? And what do prosecutors need to prove for him to get a conviction for those specific charges?
Well, essentially, the 7 charges that he's facing in this particular case, in this particular trial, fall into roughly 3 buckets. One bucket relates to fraud involving the misuse of FTX exchange depositors' funds. The allegations that he took those funds and he used them for improper purposes, namely for things like his own personal benefit or to prop up the Alameda hedge fund that he also essentially allegedly controlled. That's the first bucket. In a way, kind of the highest profile of the charges, because I think most people feel a particular affinity for potentially small depositors who put money into FTX and believed that they would get it out and may have lost all of the money they put in. The second bucket relates to an alleged fraud perpetrated against the lenders to Alameda. Alameda, as I said, is that hedge fund that he controlled. And investors lent money to Alameda. And the allegation is that the defendant did a number of things to mislead those lenders about the condition of Alameda at the time that they made loans or decided whether to call in loans that they had a right to do. The third bucket is more of a securities fraud, which relates to investors in FTX itself. FTX had investors, and there were securities in FTX. And the allegation is that the defendant made false statements about the condition of FTX to those investors, which caused them to incur losses. Those are really the three buckets of charges that he's facing here.
Now, one charge that's noticeably absent from this indictment filed in August against Sam Bankman-Fried was a campaign finance charge. And in this indictment, prosecutors allege that from 2019 until sometime in 2022, Sam Bankman-Fried misappropriated and embezzled FTX customer deposits and used the billions of dollars to fund speculative venture investments and to, quote, help fund over $100 million in campaign contributions to Democrats and Republicans to seek to influence cryptocurrency regulation, among other things. So those campaign contributions are in fact mentioned, but there's no charge. So how do you explain that?
Well, I believe that the reason that those charges are not part of this indictment relates to the decision to extradite Mr. Bankman-Fried from the Bahamas, where he was located when the charges were unsealed. And under the terms of the extradition, the agreement between the Department of Justice and the government of the Bahamas, there is apparently the Bahamas' position is that the extradition was not for the purpose of that particular charge. It was only for the purpose of the charges that he's facing in this trial. And under a legal doctrine called the rule of specialty, when you extradite someone from another country, as a general matter, you're only allowed to charge them and try them on the charges that are part of the extradition process, because those are the charges that the foreign country agreed to and understood would be charged and tried at the time of the extradition. But one thing that I think is very interesting about the campaign finance charges is that the judge in this case, the trial judge, Judge Kaplan, he's made a number of pretrial rulings in this case, almost all of which are favorable to the prosecution. And one of those rulings is that the government, it looks like, is going to be permitted to introduce evidence of those campaign finance allegations, even though those are not actually charged. Typically, in a criminal case, the prosecution is not permitted to introduce evidence of charged crimes that are not part of the charges that the defendant is facing in that particular trial. For example, just as an example, if someone's facing charges of credit card fraud, the prosecution can't also introduce evidence that they engaged in acts of domestic violence, because that would tend to have the jury think poorly of that defendant in a way that's not related to the charges they're actually deciding on. But in certain circumstances, you can, even if you're not charging a particular crime, the prosecution can get that evidence in. And one way would be if, for example, if you use the example of the domestic violence and credit card fraud, if the defendant who's charged with credit card fraud, if there's an allegation that the reason they committed that credit card fraud was to get money in order to pay off their victim of domestic violence so they wouldn't go to the police, then that would be the motive for the charged crime. And if the motive for the charged crime relates to another crime, then it can be introduced. In this case, the government's arguing that one of the motives, essentially, for SBF committing the fraud crimes was to get money that he could then use to make these campaign donations. And so the motive, allegedly, for the charged crimes is the campaign finance allegations. And so on that basis, it looks like the judge is going to let the government introduce evidence relating to the campaign finance activity as well.
Tuchmann also discusses possible defense strategies and explains what he would be looking for if he was prosecuting the case. We'll have part 2 of his interview for you in tomorrow's show. Okay, well, that's all for Crypto World today. We'll see you tomorrow.